New digital scan of the Titanic has offered an unprecedented insight into the ship's final moments. A detailed three-dimensional reconstruction of the wreck reveals engineers worked to keep the lights on even as the vessel.
A drone ventured into the Titanic's darkest depths, and what it found in a sealed room left investigators speechless. For over 100 years, this chamber had remained hidden, untouched since that fatal night in 1912. But when the cameras finally pierced the darkness, they captured something absolutely chilling. Two tiny figures, positioned as if reaching for comfort in their final moments.
The difference between Titanic sinking and not sinking are down to the fine margins of holes about the size of a piece of paper. But the problem is that those small holes are across a long length of the ship, so the floodwater comes in slowly but surely into all of those holes, and then eventually.
And nearby, a single shoe that revealed a disturbing truth about what really happened. The footage was so shocking, most of it will never be released to the public. What else is the Titanic still hiding? Recently, a team of researchers and engineers embarked on an ambitious mission to change that. Their goal was not simply to observe the Titanic from a distance, but to send an advanced underwater drone deep into sections of the ship that have been sealed off for more than 100 years. What they hoped to find was new information about the ship's final moments, clues that might help answer questions that have puzzled historians for generations. What they actually discovered would prove to be far more unsettling than anyone had anticipated. The expedition began hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, in waters known for their unpredictability. The North Atlantic is not a gentle place. Sudden storms can appear without warning, bringing massive waves and howling winds that can disable even the most modern vessels. The water temperature hovers just above freezing, and strong currents shift direction with little pattern, making navigation treacherous. For the research vessel anchored above the Titanic's resting place, these conditions meant constant vigilance. The crew had to monitor weather patterns continuously, knowing that a single miscalculation could force them to abandon the mission, or worse, put lives at risk. On board the ship was a carefully selected team of specialists, each bringing unique expertise to the operation. Deep-sea archaeologists were responsible for understanding the historical significance of anything the drone might encounter. Their job was to interpret what they saw, to distinguish between ordinary debris and objects of real importance. Marine engineers maintained the complex systems that kept the drone operational, checking and rechecking every component to ensure nothing would fail at a critical moment. Drone pilots controlled the vehicle's movements from the surface, guiding it through the darkness using only the live video feed transmitted through a thick cable. Sonar experts monitored readings that helped map the surrounding area and detect obstacles before the drone encountered them. And preservation specialists documented everything, while ensuring that the expedition caused no unnecessary damage to the fragile wreck below. The preparation for this mission had taken months. Every member of the team understood that they were attempting something extraordinarily difficult and potentially dangerous. The Titanic is not simply old, it is actively deteriorating. Bacteria and natural decay have weakened its structure to the point where certain sections could collapse at any moment. Even the vibrations from the drone's thrusters or a careless bump against a weakened wall could trigger a cascade of destruction, erasing historical evidence forever or trapping the expensive equipment in the wreckage. This meant that every movement had to be planned, every decision carefully considered. The drone itself was a marvel of modern engineering, custom-built to survive conditions that would destroy conventional equipment. Its outer shell was constructed from titanium and specialized alloys chosen for their ability to withstand immense pressure while remaining light enough for precise maneuvering. Multiple cameras were mounted at different angles, each capable of capturing ultra-high-definition footage even in near-total darkness. Powerful LED lights could be adjusted to different brightness levels, a crucial feature because too much light would stir up clouds of silt and sediment that would make visibility impossible. The drone was also equipped with laser scanning technology that could create detailed three-dimensional maps of the interior spaces, allowing researchers to study the wreck virtually without needing to return physically. A thick tether connected the drone to the research vessel on the surface. This cable served multiple purposes. It provided constant electrical power, eliminating the need for heavy batteries that would have made the drone too large and unwieldy. It also transmitted data in real time, ensuring that every second of footage was saved and that the team could react immediately to anything unexpected. The tether was both the drone's lifeline and its biggest vulnerability. If it snagged on a piece of wreckage or was severed by a sharp edge of metal, the mission would end immediately and the drone would be lost forever. After days of preparation and waiting for ideal weather conditions, the moment finally arrived. The crew completed their final checklist, inspecting every seal, every connection, every system one last time. The atmosphere on the research vessel was tense. People spoke in quiet voices, their movements deliberate and focused. When everything was confirmed ready, the drone was slowly lowered over the side of the ship and into the freezing Atlantic water. From the control room, the team watched their monitors as the drone began its descent. At first, there was nothing to see, except blackness and the occasional particle drifting past the cameras. The lights from the drone created a small bubble of visibility in an otherwise infinite void. As the vehicle sank deeper, the pressure increased with every meter. The team monitored readouts carefully, watching for any sign of stress or malfunction. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the drone continued its slow journey downward. Then gradually, the ocean floor came into view. The lights revealed a landscape of soft sediment and scattered debris. Rusted pieces of metal lay half buried in the silt. Fragments of wood, darkened and worn by more than a century underwater, were scattered across the seabed. Personal belongings, remnants of lives that ended suddenly and tragically, appeared in the lights. A shoe here, a suitcase there, each item telling its own silent story of that terrible night in April 1912. As the drone moved forward, carefully navigating around these artifacts, something massive began to emerge from the darkness ahead. At first, it was just a shadow, a darker shape against the black water. But as the drone drew closer, the shape became unmistakable. The bow of the Titanic rose from the ocean floor, its form still recognizable despite the damage and decay. Even on grainy video monitors thousands of feet above, the sight was breathtaking. Gasps and quiet exclamations filled the control room as the team members saw what they had traveled so far to find. The drone circled the exterior of the wreck slowly, its cameras recording every detail. The team could see the extent of the damage, the way the ship had broken apart as it sank, the areas where rust and decay had eaten away at the metal structure. But the exterior, impressive as it was not their ultimate destination. With the outside fully documented, the team prepared for the next and most challenging phase of their mission. They were going to send the drone inside the Titanic, into passages and rooms that had been sealed in darkness and silence since the moment the ship went down. What they would find in those forgotten spaces would challenge everything they thought they knew about the disaster and reveal secrets that perhaps should have remained hidden forever. Before it became a grave on the ocean floor, the Titanic represented something entirely different to the world. In the early years of the 20th century, it stood as a symbol of human achievement and technological progress. The ship was not simply large, it was the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands at that time. Its designers and builders saw it as proof that humanity had conquered the challenges of ocean travel, that engineering and ambition could overcome the dangers that had claimed so many vessels throughout history. The ship was celebrated in newspapers and magazines across Europe and America. People spoke of it with pride and excitement, viewing it as a vessel that would usher in a new era of safe and luxurious transatlantic travel. The Titanic was built in Belfast, Ireland, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Construction took nearly 3 years and required the labor of thousands of workers. The ship measured more than 880 feet in length and weighed approximately 46,000 tons. Its design incorporated what were considered advanced safety features for the time. including a system of watertight compartments that could be sealed off if the hull was breached. This design led many to believe, incorrectly as it turned out, that the ship was virtually unsinkable. The designers had calculated that the Titanic could survive significant damage and still remain afloat, a claim that would be tragically disproven. Life aboard the Titanic varied dramatically depending on which class a passenger belonged to. First-class passengers experienced luxury that rivaled the finest hotels in the world. Their accommodations included spacious suites with private sitting rooms, ornate furnishings imported from Europe, and access to amenities such as a gymnasium, a swimming pool, and even a squash court. The dining rooms in first class were decorated with elaborate wood paneling and featured chandeliers, plush carpets, and furniture designed specifically for the ship. The grand staircase, which connected several decks, was perhaps the most impressive feature of all. It was constructed from solid oak with wrought iron detailing and topped by a glass dome that allowed natural light to filter down through the levels. This staircase was designed not merely for function, but as a statement of wealth and sophistication. Second-class accommodations on the Titanic were comparable to first class on many other ships of the era. Passengers in this section enjoyed comfortable cabins, well-appointed dining areas, and access to their own promenade decks. For middle-class travelers, booking passage on the Titanic represented a significant but worthwhile expense, offering both comfort and prestige. Third class was a different world entirely, though still better than steerage on many competing vessels. These passengers were primarily immigrants, families leaving Europe in search of better opportunities in America. They traveled with their life savings, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, hoping to start fresh in a new country. For them, the Titanic was not about luxury. It was about hope and the promise of a better future. The accommodations were basic but clean, with shared dining areas and limited access to open deck space. Still, many third-class passengers were excited simply to be aboard such a famous and modern ship. The Titanic departed from Southampton, England, on April 10, 1912. It made brief stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, to collect additional passengers before heading out into the Atlantic Ocean toward New York City. The first few days of the voyage proceeded smoothly. The weather was calm, the ship ran well, and passengers settled into the routines of ocean travel. Many spent their time socializing, dining, or simply enjoying the experience of being aboard the world's most talked-about vessel. Then came the night of April 14th. The ship was traveling through an area of the North Atlantic known to have icebergs at that time of year. Warnings had been received from other ships in the region, but for reasons that historians still debate, the Titanic maintained its speed. Just before midnight, a lookout spotted an iceberg directly in the ship's path. The crew attempted to turn and avoid collision, but the ship was too large and moving too fast to change direction quickly enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull below the waterline, opening the ship to the sea. At first, many passengers were unaware of how serious the damage was. The collision had not been violent or particularly loud. Some people barely noticed it at all. But below deck, water was pouring into the forward compartments at an alarming rate. The watertight doors were closed, but the design flaw that would doom the ship quickly became apparent. The compartments were not sealed at the top. As each one filled with water, it spilled over into the next, creating a chain reaction that could not be stopped. The ship's designer, who was aboard for the maiden voyage, quickly calculated that the Titanic had only a few hours before it would sink completely. What followed were scenes of confusion, panic, and heartbreaking tragedy. The crew began loading passengers into lifeboats, but there were not enough boats for everyone on board. This was not an oversight unique to the Titanic, as maritime regulations at the time did not require enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. The assumption had been that lifeboats were primarily for ferrying people to rescue ships, not for long-term survival at sea. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. As the situation became more desperate, families were torn apart. The protocol was women and children first, which meant that husbands were separated from wives, fathers from their children. Some men attempted to force their way onto boats, while others stood back and accepted their fate with quiet dignity. Third-class passengers faced additional obstacles, as many were trapped below deck by locked gates and confusing corridors. By the time some of them reached the boat deck, most of the lifeboats had already been launched. The ship tilted further and further as more compartments flooded. Eventually, the stress on the hull became too great, and the Titanic broke apart, the stern section rising high into the air before both halves plunged to the ocean floor. Those who ended up in the freezing water had only minutes before hypothermia set in. The few lifeboats that were already away rowed desperately to avoid being pulled down by the suction of the sinking ship. Most refused to return to pick up survivors, fearing they would be swamped by desperate people in the water. When rescue ships finally arrived hours later, they found only about 700 survivors. More than 1,500 people had perished, making it one of the worst maritime disasters in history. The news spread around the world within days, causing shock and grief in communities across multiple continents. Inquiries were held in both America and Britain, examining what had gone wrong and who was responsible. The disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations, including requirements for sufficient lifeboats and 24-hour radio watch on passenger vessels. For more than 70 years, the Titanic remained lost in the depths of the Atlantic. Many expeditions searched for it without success. The ocean is vast, and even a ship as large as the Titanic is a tiny object when compared to the thousands of square miles of seafloor where it might have come to rest. Then in 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard led a joint French and American expedition using advanced sonar technology to scan the ocean floor. After days of searching, the sonar detected something unusual. When cameras were sent down to investigate, they revealed the unmistakable outline of the Titanic's bow section, still remarkably intact despite its long rest on the bottom. The discovery captured global attention and reignited fascination with the disaster. Ballard and his team returned for more detailed surveys, and over the years other expeditions followed. Most of these missions focused on documenting the exterior of the wreck and the surrounding debris field. The interior was considered too dangerous to explore. Passages were narrow and unstable, blocked by debris, and weakened by decades of deterioration. The risk of damaging the site or losing expensive equipment was simply too high. But technology continued to advance, and eventually, engineers believed they had developed equipment capable of safely navigating inside the wreck. This new drone represented years of research and development, incorporating lessons learned from previous deep-sea exploration missions. The team preparing to use it understood they had an opportunity to see things no one had witnessed since 1912, to document spaces that had been sealed away from the world for more than a century. They also understood the immense responsibility that came with that opportunity, knowing they were entering what was essentially an underwater tomb where more than 1,000 people had lost their lives. The drone's entry into the Titanic's interior marked a transition from external observation to something far more intimate and unsettling. The opening through which it passed was narrow, requiring careful navigation by the operators who watched from the surface. The first images transmitted back showed what one would expect from a shipwreck of this age: darkness, silt suspended in the water, and the deteriorated remains of what had once been passages filled with activity and life. The drone's powerful lights cut through the murky water, revealing corridors that had not been illuminated in over a century. As the vehicle moved deeper into the ship, the extent of the destruction became apparent. Some sections had collapsed entirely, with walls buckled inward and ceilings sagging at dangerous angles. Debris littered the floors, making navigation treacherous. The operators had to constantly adjust the drone's position, moving it slowly and deliberately to avoid collisions that could damage both the equipment and the fragile structure around it. Every movement stirred up clouds of sediment that took minutes to settle, forcing the team to wait patiently between maneuvers. But not everything was destroyed. In fact, what surprised the researchers most was how well preserved certain areas remained. The extreme depth, near freezing temperatures, and low oxygen levels had created conditions that slowed decay significantly. In some rooms, furniture remained upright exactly where it had been positioned more than 100 years earlier. Tables sat undisturbed, their surfaces covered with a layer of fine silt, but otherwise intact. Chairs were arranged as if waiting for occupants who would never return. In what appeared to be a dining area, dishes and glassware lay scattered across the floor, many of them unbroken despite the violence of the sinking and the years that followed. Personal belongings appeared throughout the wreck, each one a haunting reminder of the individuals who had carried them aboard. Suitcases rested where they had fallen, some with their contents spilling out into the water. Shoes were particularly common, their leather preserved by the cold and the absence of oxygen consuming bacteria. Seeing these items was deeply affecting for the research team. These were not just artifacts or historical curiosities. They were the possessions of real people who had packed them with care, planning for a journey and a future that would never materialize. The grand staircase, once the centerpiece of the ship's first-class areas, appeared on the monitors as a skeletal shadow of its former glory. The ornate wood paneling had largely disappeared, consumed by bacteria and decay. What remained was the underlying metal framework, now covered in rust and strange formations known as rusticles. These rust structures hang like icicles from metal surfaces in shipwrecks, created by iron-eating bacteria that slowly consume the ship from the inside out. Despite the deterioration, the basic shape of the staircase was still recognizable, offering a ghostly echo of the elegance that had once defined this space. Using the drone's laser mapping technology, the team began creating detailed three-dimensional models of the interior. These digital reconstructions would allow scientists to study the wreck without physically returning to it, preserving the site from unnecessary disturbance. The scans revealed information about how different sections of the ship were deteriorating at different rates. Some areas appeared stable for now, while others showed clear signs that they could collapse at any time. This data would be valuable for planning future expeditions and for understanding how much longer the Titanic might survive before deteriorating completely. As the drone explored a section of the ship that had never been accessed before, something unusual appeared in the video feed. Beneath a pile of debris and twisted metal, there was what appeared to be a doorway. Unlike the damaged and collapsed passages elsewhere in the wreck, this doorway seemed oddly intact. Its frame was still square and properly aligned, which was surprising given the structural damage all around it. The edges were clean, almost too clean, as if the space behind the door had somehow been protected from the chaos that had destroyed so much of the surrounding area. What made the discovery even more peculiar was a faint disturbance in the silt near the gap at the bottom of the door. The pattern suggested that something had once moved or shifted behind it, disturbing the sediment and allowing it to drift outward. In the control room, the operators studied the images carefully. Some suggested it might lead to storage areas or crew quarters that had been sealed off when that section flooded. Others were less willing to speculate, but their silence spoke volumes. There was something unsettling about the doorway, something that triggered an instinctive unease among those watching. The team debated whether to attempt opening it or forcing the drone through. The risks were significant. The structure around the doorway could collapse if disturbed, potentially trapping or destroying the drone. There was also the question of what they might find on the other side. The discussion revealed deeper tensions within the group about the nature of their mission. Were they scientists pursuing knowledge, or were they intruders disturbing a mass grave? The line between those two positions was becoming increasingly blurred. This question of ethics had been present from the beginning, but became more pressing as the mission progressed. Before any footage was released to the public or even shared within the wider scientific community, the team held lengthy discussions about their responsibilities. Some members argued that complete transparency was essential, that showing the wreck exactly as it appeared was necessary for historical accuracy and public education. Others worried about the impact such images might have, particularly on the descendants of those who died when the ship went down. The team decided to establish guidelines for what would be made public. According to several reports, any footage that appeared to show human remains or deeply personal items that could cause distress was kept confidential. Only images deemed appropriate for general viewing would be released, and even those would be carefully contextualized to ensure they were treated with proper respect. This decision was not made lightly. and it reflected the genuine struggle the researchers faced between their scientific mission and their moral obligations. The team also reached out to families of Titanic victims and survivors, seeking their input on how the expedition should be conducted and what should be shared. The responses were mixed and often emotional. Some family members expressed gratitude that their relatives were being remembered and that new information about the disaster might be uncovered. They saw the expedition as a form of tribute, a way of ensuring that those who died would not be forgotten. Others felt very differently. They believed that the Titanic should be left alone, that it was a gravesite that deserved to remain undisturbed. For these families, the idea of cameras moving through the wreck felt invasive and disrespectful, regardless of the scientific value. These conflicting perspectives placed a heavy burden on the research team. They were acutely aware that their work would be scrutinized, that their decisions about what to explore and what to reveal would be judged by historians, ethicists, and the public. The responsibility weighed on them as they continued their mission, making every choice more difficult and more significant. Physical care for the wreck was also paramount. The Titanic has been underwater for so long that its metal structure is severely weakened. Even minor disturbances can cause sections to collapse. The drone was operated with extreme precision to minimize any impact. Operators moved it slowly, keeping it centered in passages to avoid bumping walls. They adjusted the thruster power carefully to prevent strong currents that might disturb loose debris. Every decision was made with the preservation of the site in mind, balancing the desire for discovery with the need to protect what remained. As the mission continued, the team began to notice details in the footage that challenged some long-held beliefs about the sinking. The placement of objects, the patterns of damage, and the condition of different sections did not always match what historians had predicted based on survivor accounts and previous research. These discrepancies suggested that the final hours of the Titanic were even more chaotic and complex than anyone had realized. The ship had not simply filled with water and sunk in an orderly fashion. Instead, the disaster had been marked by sudden surges, violent structural failures, and forces that tore through the vessel in unpredictable ways. The drone continued deeper, moving toward areas that would reveal even more disturbing evidence about those final moments. The sealed doorway remained marked on their maps, a mystery they had chosen not to solve. But ahead lay another sealed section, one that they would enter, and what they found there would haunt the entire team for the rest of their lives. The drone approached a section of the wreck that had been completely inaccessible until this mission. Fallen beams and collapsed ceiling panels had created a barrier that sealed off an entire chamber from the rest of the ship. Getting inside required the operators to guide the drone through gaps barely wider than the vehicle itself. The margin for error was essentially non-existent. A single miscalculation could wedge the drone between pieces of wreckage, trapping it permanently in the darkness. The operators worked in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the monitors as they made tiny adjustments to the drone's position. The passage through the debris field seemed to take forever. Centimeter by centimeter, the drone squeezed through openings that looked impossibly narrow on the video feed. Metal fragments scraped against the titanium hull, creating sounds that were picked up by the drone's sensors and transmitted back to the surface. Each scrape made the operators wince, knowing that one sharp edge in the wrong place could sever the tether and end the mission instantly. But slowly, carefully, the drone made it through. On the other side, the video feed showed a room that appeared frozen in time. Unlike the collapsed corridors and destroyed sections they had seen elsewhere, this space was remarkably intact. The walls still stood at proper angles, and the ceiling, though sagging slightly, had not collapsed. Furniture lay toppled across the floor, but it was recognizable as furniture rather than the twisted wreckage that filled so much of the ship. Suitcases were scattered throughout the room, some closed and some with their contents spilling out. Dishes and personal items lay where they had fallen during the violent moments when the ship went down. The preservation was extraordinary. The cold water and lack of oxygen had prevented the rapid decay that would have occurred under normal conditions. Fabric that should have rotted away decades ago still clung to objects, its patterns and colors muted but visible. The freezing temperatures had essentially turned this chamber into a time capsule, preserving a moment from April 1912 in ways that seemed almost impossible given how much time had passed. The drone's lights moved slowly across the chamber, recording everything in meticulous detail. The operators were careful to document the space thoroughly, knowing this might be the only opportunity anyone would ever have to see it. The lights swept past overturned chairs, past a water jug still sitting upright on what appeared to be a small table, past shoes arranged in a way that suggested they had been placed there deliberately, rather than scattered by the chaos of the sinking. Then the lights caught something in the far corner of the room, and everything changed. At first, it looked like more wreckage, just another shadow among the debris. But as the drone moved closer and the image on the monitor sharpened, it became clear that this was not wreckage at all. What they were seeing was unmistakably human remains. The silence in the control room became absolute. Several people stopped breathing. Others leaned closer to their screens, as if getting nearer might somehow change what they were seeing. The figure was small, far too small to be an adult. The proportions of the skeletal remains left no doubt that this had been a child. The body lay on its side in a slightly curled position, with fragments of clothing still visible among the bones. The cold water had preserved even these delicate fabrics, creating a haunting outline of what the child had been wearing on that terrible night. Age had reduced much of the clothing to fragments, but enough remained to show patterns and textures that made the scene feel impossibly personal and real. As the drone adjusted its position to document the discovery, another form came into view just inches away from the first. A second set of remains, also clearly belonging to a child, lay so close to the first that they were nearly touching. The positioning was what struck the observers most powerfully. According to multiple team members who were present in the control room, the two bodies appeared to have been holding each other when they died. The bones were not intertwined or locked together in an embrace, but the arrangement suggested that in their final moments, these children had been together, perhaps trying to comfort each other as the water rose around them and the ship plunged toward the ocean floor. The control room remained silent. Some operators covered their mouths, unable to process what they were witnessing. Others turned away from their screens, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the discovery. A few people left the room entirely, needing distance from the images that would be burned into their memories forever. This was not just a historical artifact or scientific data point. This was evidence of real suffering, of children who had died in terror and darkness more than a century ago. The drone continued its slow survey of the chamber, and that was when it revealed something that deepened the horror of what they had found. Just a few feet from the children's remains, half buried in the layer of silt that covered the floor, was a shoe. This was clearly an adult's shoe, larger and differently constructed than anything a child would wear. The leather was darkened and waterlogged, but the stitching was still faintly visible along the seams. The sole showed wear patterns consistent with regular use. This was not some random piece of debris. This was a shoe that someone had been wearing, and its presence raised questions that no one wanted to voice aloud. Where was the rest of the body? If an adult had been in this room with the children, what had happened to that person? The shoe was the only evidence that an adult had been present at all. Some team members suggested that the body might have been swept away by currents after the ship settled on the ocean floor. The wreck had not remained perfectly still over the decades. Water movement, even at these depths, could have shifted lighter remains while leaving heavier objects like shoes behind. This explanation was plausible and offered a rational answer to the mystery. But others were not convinced. Whispered conversations began among the researchers, theories forming that were far more disturbing. Had the adult died elsewhere, and the shoe simply drifted into this room? Or had the person been there with the children, but then left, making a desperate attempt to reach safety, while the children remained behind? The thought was almost unbearable to consider. The idea that someone might have abandoned children in those final moments, choosing their own survival over staying with the young ones in their care, was horrifying. Yet it was not impossible. The sinking of the Titanic had been marked by chaos and panic, by impossible decisions made in the worst circumstances imaginable. The team would never know the full story. The shoe and the children's remains were all that remained of whatever tragedy had unfolded in that sealed chamber. But the discovery forced everyone involved to confront the human reality of the disaster in a way that statistics and historical accounts never could. These were not just numbers in a casualty list. These had been real children with names and families, children who had been excited about the journey to America or frightened by the strange new ship, children who had played and eaten and slept in these very spaces before everything went terribly wrong. The team understood immediately that what they had found would spark controversy. The existence of human remains inside the Titanic had long been suspected, but this was the first time any had been definitively documented with clear video evidence. After extensive discussions, the decision was made to keep most of the footage private. Only a few carefully selected still images would be preserved for historical study, and even those would be restricted to a small group of researchers. The full video, showing the children's remains in detail, would be locked away and access strictly controlled. According to reports, not every member of the team was even allowed to review the complete footage. The leadership decided that limiting exposure was the most respectful approach, both for the memory of the children and for the mental well-being of the crew. Some team members disagreed with this decision, arguing that transparency was important and that hiding the footage might fuel conspiracy theories. But the majority felt that discretion was the right choice, that some things should remain private even in the pursuit of knowledge. As the drone carefully backed out of the chamber and began its long ascent to the surface, a heavy silence filled the control room. People stood quietly, processing what they had witnessed. Some crew members were visibly shaken, their hands trembling as they shut down systems and secured equipment. Others moved mechanically through their tasks, their faces blank as they tried to compartmentalize the experience. The mission had been a technical success, yielding unprecedented footage and data about the Titanic's interior. But it had also extracted an emotional cost that no one had fully anticipated. When the drone finally broke the surface and was lifted back onto the research vessel, the team gathered on deck. They stood together in the cold Atlantic air, looking out at the water that concealed so much tragedy beneath its surface. No one spoke about what they had seen. There would be time for that later, in debriefing sessions and private conversations. For now, they simply stood together, united by an experience that had changed them all. Back on land, the information from the mission was initially shared only within select academic circles. Historians and marine archaeologists were invited to closed sessions, where they examined the data and discussed its implications. The team released carefully worded statements that acknowledged significant discoveries had been made, but provided few specific details. This approach was deliberate, an attempt to control the narrative and prevent sensationalism. But secrets of this magnitude rarely stay contained for long. Within weeks, small leaks began appearing online. Blurred images and fragments of information surfaced on obscure forums and social media accounts, reportedly shared by someone with connections to the research team. These leaks were quickly taken down, but not before they had been copied and spread further. The official team remained silent, refusing to confirm or deny the rumors. This silence only intensified public curiosity and speculation. The discovery reignited long-standing debates about whether the Titanic should continue to be explored or left alone as a memorial. Scientists pointed out that the wreck is deteriorating rapidly, and that valuable historical information could be lost forever if not documented soon. Religious leaders and ethicists countered that the site is fundamentally a mass grave and should be treated with the same respect afforded to any cemetery. Families of victims remained divided, with some grateful for the continued attention to their relatives' memory, and others angry at what they perceived as exploitation of tragedy. The question of what should happen next remains unresolved. Technology will continue to advance, making even deeper and more detailed exploration possible. But whether humanity should use that technology to probe every corner of the wreck is a moral question that science alone cannot answer. The Titanic holds more secrets, undoubtedly, but perhaps some secrets are meant to stay buried in the darkness where they have rested for more than a century. The children in that sealed chamber waited in silence for so long, and now that they have been found, the world must decide whether to respect their rest or continue searching for answers that may be too painful to bear.